Brendan, you there? Brendan,
Hi,
we have got you. Jeez, that was dodgy. I thought someone was interfering with the phone lines. Hey, lovely to have you back on the platform, Brendan. And I would like to say thank you for dumping all over my country in the latest your column in the Spectator. But in some ways, I imagine many New Zealanders think that we deserve it. And I've really got you on because I want to get a perspective from the other side of the world as to how what happened at Albert Park on Saturday here in New Zealand is being viewed by the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think it's really pushed New Zealand down in many people's estimations. I mean, that's certainly been my experience, and I know lots of women in particular here in the UK are now looking at New Zealand and thinking, you know, how did this happen? How did New Zealand come to this? I think, you know, what we saw on Saturday in Auckland, let's be brutal about it, this was a deranged mob. This was a feral mob of misogynists who were screaming at a woman, screaming expletives at her, throwing things in her face, throwing placards and water and soup. And in my Spectator piece, I likened it to a witch trial of the 1500s. That's the real atmosphere that one could feel from that event in Auckland, and it was pretty shocking. So I think a lot of people are now looking at New Zealand and thinking to themselves, how has New Zealand arrived at a situation where such a disgusting mob attack can take place against a woman who simply wanted to stand in a public place and say that a woman is an adult human female?
We have politicians, we have ministers who are saying it was a wonderful celebration. That is the most shocking thing, that the elements in the mainstream, both the mainstream media and mainstream politics, who are trying to defend what happened in Auckland, and they're using real doublespeak. They're saying this was a loving event celebrating diversity. It was about affirming people's identities. Real Orwellian use of language to describe something that was actually a witch trial. It was a mob. It was a gathering of deranged people who were acting in concert to try and prevent a woman from expressing herself freely in public. So we have to be honest about it. And the twisting of it to say that it was a positive event, that it was about celebrating gender identity and trans identity, it wasn't. It was a misogynistic gathering that was designed to suppress women's voices, and we need to be more honest about that. Yeah. Brendan, I'll be honest. I hardly knew who Posie Parker was, Kelly J, who I've spoken to a few times now 4 weeks ago. But a Green MP here, a Mexican guy called Ricardo Mendinez March, got coverage, of course, in our Liberal Stuff newspaper, saying he wanted to stop this woman known as Posie Parker from coming to New Zealand. And suddenly she was in the consciousness. Then there was the Melbourne event, and she was a Nazi and everyone was a Nazi. And our Liberal media, including Television New Zealand, Radio New Zealand, they branded Kelly J or Posie as anti-transgender activist, and our mainstream papers were full of negative connotations. People were freeze-framing her, doing up her jacket, saying she was pulling a Nazi sign. It was a hysteria totally self-created by the opposition to her, which of course heightened her profile. And literally we had mainstream media and our politicians who, while they didn't bar her coming, made it clear they didn't like her. We as a society lured her into a trap, and our police stood by and did nothing while she was attacked, and it would seem quite deliberately did nothing. I'm wondering, she's now famous in New Zealand, obviously. I'm wondering how famous she was in Britain, or has what happened in New Zealand thrust her into the spotlight there as well?
She was fairly well known in Britain. She has been having these kinds of events in the UK for a few years now. I've been on a couple of them, and I think they're a great idea, where these women gather in public to say men are men and women are women, and one cannot become the other. I'm entirely in favour of people freely expressing that idea. So people were aware of her. They did know that she does these events, and there have been flashpoints at some of the events she's done here in the UK. Not as bad as what we witnessed in Auckland, but there have been tensions, and we have seen some rough situations. So people are aware of her, but they're far more aware of her now because of what happened in New Zealand. And I've seen a lot of trans activists saying, we've defeated Posie Parker, we've driven her out of New Zealand, she's been silenced. Actually, I think this could backfire enormously.
I think it already is.
Yeah. And it already is. And she has become better known. Lots of people, millions of people have now watched that footage of the mob attack in Auckland. And they will be asking themselves, they will be thinking to themselves, this has gone further than I thought. The intolerance of women's voices, the misogyny that hides behind the facade of trans activism, it's worse than I thought it was. And maybe
are you telling me we are going to have to make another Lord of the Rings series to get over this? Has she replaced? Has that replaced Bilbo Baggins?
I think you're going to have to do something, because in a lot of people's minds, New Zealand is now associated with what we've seen on the news over the past few days. I mean, we don't get a great deal of coverage of New Zealand over here. I mean, we did get some, very pro-Jacinda Ardern stuff. Liberals across the West absolutely love Jacinda Ardern. So we got a lot of that over the past few years. But this has really caught people's attention, especially on the internet. And I think you make a real when you say that politicians in New Zealand and also in Australia, I think they kind of set her up for attack in Auckland.
Yeah.
Because when you demonise someone as a Nazi, and when you say she's beyond the pale, she's evil, she's anti-trans, she shouldn't be allowed in our country because she's too toxic, she's too dangerous, you actually goad the mob to say, well, we're going to take this into our own hands and do something about it. So the media and politicians demonised her to such an extent that they actually whipped up this mob fury. So
Brendan, I hate to tell you, but the Prime Minister told me to my face yesterday that in some ways what happened in the weekend was a celebration.
I mean, it is really just extraordinary that people can think in that way, and it shows how clueless they are, and it shows how out of touch they are with reality. But in a sense, that actually adds up, because if you reject the objective truth of biological sex, then you can easily reject the objective truth that this was a mob attack, this was a witch hunt, this was a violent attempt to stop someone from speaking. But if you've given up on reason and truth and reality to such an extent...
Doesn't matter, does it? You're off to the races anyway.
You can say whatever you want about anything, and I think we're seeing the consequences of that culture play out now.
Brendan, some big names have got on board with this. J.K. Rowling, who, of course, the extremist rainbow people love to hate. I think Joe Rogan's talking about it. Jordan Peterson has come out about it. What are you seeing in terms of, if you like, international influences saying what's happening in New Zealand?
I think, you're right. A lot of those big voices are now saying what's going on here. Firstly, what's going on in New Zealand, and also what's going on with this trans issue. People are paying a lot more attention to it. I had an extraordinary amount of feedback to the piece I wrote for The Spectator. It was shared by Jordan Peterson and lots of other people, because all I did was just describe in words what I had seen on the video clips, and I think a lot of people have been shocked by what they've seen. They want to know how New Zealand got to this situation. Is this what wokeness does to a country? And also they want to know how we're going to move forward so that we can defend women's rights and freedom of speech from the trans assault.
Yeah. Brendan, the other thing that's happened, and I do follow these issues and read your stuff, God forgive me, from time to time. I've looked at what's happened with Tavistock. And you guys have been, 10, 15 years ahead of us on this. And it is now clear that the genital or state-sponsored genital mutilation of people with gender dysphoria has caused some terrible damage, irreversible damage to individuals. The Tavistock Clinic has been shut down, and serious questions are being asked about the policies that Britain has pursued in the last 10, 15 years. It seems to me our media and our liberal body politic are almost trying to insulate New Zealand from that reality. and that we are going to try and leap past those uncomfortable truths in this country and continue the woke revolution.
Well, that is exactly why freedom of speech is so important. And that's exactly why someone like Posie Parker and the other women who work with her, that's why they are important, because what they're trying to do, I spoke to Kelly J. Keane, Posie Parker, earlier today, and she said all we're trying to do is explain to people in very clear language what is happening. For example, men are going into women's changing areas, women's domestic violence shelters, women's sports where they don't belong. And also young people, as you mentioned, are being put on puberty blockers. They're having irreversible damage done to their bodies, to their ability to have children in the future. Young lesbians in particular and young gay men are being transed out of their sexuality, so they're being turned from lesbians into boys and from gay men into women. All those kinds of things are taking place, and it's shocking. And I think it's the great medical scandal of our time. And I hope that in a few years' time we will look back and think, what the hell were we playing at? But at the moment, everyone is going along with it, partly because you're not allowed to dissent. So the more dissent we have, the more questioning, the more criticism, the better the situation might become over the long term.
Yeah. I understand Posie is also, or Kelly J is also planning some sort of demonstration outside New Zealand House in London.
Yeah, she mentioned that. She said that they're planning some kind of protest there, I think, in the next few days, so it's worth keeping an eye on that. But also lots of organisations here in Britain, including the Free Speech Union, which is a very important free speech lobby group in Britain. They have written to our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and called on him to make representations to the New Zealand High Commission to ask them, why was this British citizen not allowed to exercise her rights in your country? And I hope Rishi Sunak does that. I hope he...
What do you think the chances are, Brendan?
I think they're probably quite low, but I think pressure can be put on him to at least write a letter or ask a question, because I would hope that, I'm a British citizen, I would hope that if I went somewhere and I was treated in that way and I was denied the basic right that New Zealanders and Brits are both supposed to enjoy, which is the right to speak or the right to gather in a public place. If that happened to me, I would hope that someone in the UK would say something or make an expression of disapproval. So I do hope he does that for Kelly J. Keane. I hope he makes representations, and I hope he asks questions. We'll see if that happens, but I think the planned protest at New Zealand House here in London will be quite an important event as well.
Yeah. Brendan, I will ask you because, and I'll be honest, if you like, the so-called rainbow community, though I must add too, many, particularly lesbian in New Zealand, and many homosexuals and transgender people are coming forward now saying, I do not want to be associated with what happened on Saturday. That community isn't my community, which I think has been a really interesting development. A lot of questions asked about who runs, who pays, who funds Posie Parker or Kelly J, where her money comes from, and of course the typical accusation that it is right-wing think tanks, right-wing groups, shady groups, Trump supporters funneling money to her for a highly coordinated propaganda campaign against freedom. Have you seen any evidence of that? And do we know actually how this works? And I'll also say that I tried to get her safe houses. I felt like a member of the frickin' French resistance over the weekend. And it struck me that actually pretty disorganised and pretty naive in terms of what they were going to face in New Zealand. But are they a well-organised group with dark secret funders from the far right?
No, not at all. I mean, they're a well-organised group. They're a very committed group of women. I think they're brilliant, actually, and I've met quite a few of them. They're very committed to telling the truth. They're very committed to understanding biology and explaining facts to ordinary people. They're quite a populist movement. I think it's quite interesting that the reason some feminists, even here in Britain, the reason they don't like Posie Parker is because they see her as a populist. She's too involved in talking to ordinary people, which I actually think is her great strength. But I think in terms of the funding, I don't know where her funding comes from. I expect she probably does get some funding from some right-leaning think tanks in the US and maybe elsewhere as well. But my response when people raise that point, I always say to them, yeah, but that's because the left has completely taken leave of its senses, and it refuses to support women, it refuses to support freedom of speech, and it has gone fully down the road, the irrational road, of believing that you can change your sex at the click of your fingers, and that offensive speech must be crushed, and that any woman who gets out of line needs to be put back in her box. So why on earth would she have anything to do with the left? They think she's a fascist. So she obviously looks for funding among people who would be described as conservative, or maybe people on the right. But the idea that she is a spokesperson for Nazism is just a grotesque libel. And I'm surprised that more people making that accusation aren't worried about what the consequences might be. And I thought the way in which some people in Australia, including the media, accused her of being a Nazi was just such a low attempt to demonise her and assassinate her character.
Well, unfortunately, Brendan, in New Zealand, all of our major news organisations, all of which receive significant funding for the government with strings attached, have joined the pile-on. There is no way in the mainstream to get the truth about what happened here, or any objectivity. It just does not exist.
And that's what's really quite scary about this. And as you were saying earlier, it leaves us in a situation where even though people can see with their own eyes that this was a very unstable, mob-like assault on someone exercising their freedom of speech, we can all see that with our own eyes. Even then, the mainstream feels pretty content to say it was a lovely event, it was a wonderful event.
I can tell you what they're doing in the last couple of days, Brendan. They've been interviewing, highlighting, and laying the groundwork for the martyrdom of Ila Rabushkin, the man who threw the tomato sauce. They're basically setting them up, and I'm getting reports that she's been invited to speak at the UN.
It's disgusting, to be honest. You know, the fact that this person, who I understand is either intersex or trans, but certainly has male qualities from what I can tell, attacked a woman, a pretty small woman, a mother, a woman who simply wanted to tell some truths in public, and then they're being celebrated for that attack. And we've had that, we've seen similar celebrations in Britain. We've seen a Scottish politician here put up a picture of tomato soup saying, ooh, I'm going to dig into some tomato soup or something like that. And it took J.K. Rowling to call him out and say this is really an underhand celebration of violence against women. So we've seen that over here as well. And the way in which the tins of tomato soup have become a symbol of resistance, actually that's a symbol of male violence against women and against freedom of speech. And anyone celebrating that attack, all the other attacks, that, you know, she had a placard thrown in her face, she had water thrown all over her.
Look, it's all on video, Brendan. And the police literally stood, you know, yards away with people begging them to come and rescue her. And we had an eyewitness on this morning, actually the head of our free speech union in New Zealand, who was standing by this police detachment, who said, if Posie Parker chooses to be here, that's her problem. It's a public space. Anyone can approach her. She should go home.
It's shocking. The police reneged on their responsibilities. And in the process, whether wittingly or unwittingly, they gave a green light to the mob. Because when you step back like that, you're basically saying, we're not going to intervene, do what you want. And they did what they want, and it was pretty shocking. But you know what we witnessed, I said this in my Spectator piece, this was a ritual, this was a public shaming of a witch. This was the violent purging of someone who is looked upon as a heretic. It had a really medieval feel to it. And anyone who's trying to say that it was a wonderful, politically correct, loving gathering of pro-trans people, they are flat out lying. That is a lie. This was a violent assault on a modern-day witch by a bunch of hysterics, and that's what we've got to call it.
Well, Brendan, next time you write on this, on Talking This, could I just suggest this? There are many, many New Zealanders who are deeply disturbed by what they saw on Saturday, despite the fact they live in a country where the media messaging they get largely tries to brainwash them and get them to be compliant. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders are deeply disturbed And hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders are deeply sorry for what happened. And look, thousands of them have contacted me and said, could you please get through to Kelly J our apologies and our shame at what happened in our country. So it isn't all one-way traffic. Thank you so much for that perspective today, Brendan. Now, I've got a slight bone to pick with you. We had a great chat with you last year. You're a hard man to get hold of. I would love to have your perspective on the platform more often because, to be honest, we get precious little apart from CNN and woke international news here. So just pick up your phone occasionally, mate.
I will do. I promise you. I promise.
And we will recommend that people read your Spectator article and also, of course, your stuff in Spiked Online. Brendan, thank you so much for your time, mate. Have a good evening. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Brendan O'Neill, Chief Political Writer for Spiked. Great piece in the Spectator you should have a look at. And there it is. There's what the rest of the world is thinking of us. And let's just say, I don't think that's quite so hot. So we're going to have to, Peter Jackson, dust off the camera. We need to make a new blockbuster, mate, or the image of New Zealand is not going to be cute people with hairy feet in Hobbiton. It is going to be an angry mob beating up on a group of women while the police stand by. Not the greatest 100% pure video you could ever hope for. Quick break.